All right. And we're live here today. Douglas Ferguson, as usual. And today I'm joined with Joan P. Ball. Welcome, Joan.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Of course, doing well, and it's great to have you here. It's been a long time in the making. I think we met on Clubhouse when Clubhouse was a brand new thing during the height of the pandemic, and we had a few chats about doing this at some point, and super excited to finally be doing that.
Yeah, I'm really glad to connect with you. I'm looking forward to this conversation for sure.
And what an amazing time for you, because you just launched a book worldwide, and the North American release is imminent. I think
Yeah.
we're talking like 2 weeks or something.
Yeah, April 26th in North America, but already worldwide. So it's really exciting to have people posting, holding the book in their hand. It's exciting to take an idea or a set of ideas and suddenly they're in tangible form and they're in people's hands. It's a process. It's exciting.
And I'm sure folks can find it everywhere that you find books these
Yeah.
days. Okay.
Yeah, it's on Amazon and bookstores, so on and so forth. And for the people who are in North America, they can certainly pre-order it and get it there. But let's have a chat and not hawk a book. But
Yeah, no
I
worries.
appreciate you bringing it to the fore.
So, we were talking a bit about, how there's so much in the world that's been developed around leadership techniques and team development and ways that we might just understand how to be effective. Yet it doesn't necessarily equip people for those obstacles they might run into.
Yeah, this is something I've been looking at stuckness actually as a starting place for thinking about where leaders get stuck, where people on their teams get stuck. And that inquiry brought me to this question of what do people do when they face disruptions and interruptions? We have a ton of resources about how to be our best selves, right? As leaders, as members of organizations, we want to be more vulnerable. We want to be more empathetic. We want to learn to have a growth mindset, have more grit, all wonderful ideals. But when something unexpected happens, or if we find ourselves, even if it is expected, but in some kind of an uncertain transition where we're not sure who we're supposed to be or which direction we're supposed to take, it seems like we abandon the ideals for a more reactive sort of response, and that can get us into a lot of trouble. And because we think we can plan our way about it, we actually don't do much to prepare ourselves for those. In my work, I call them what now moments. How do we prepare for what now moments is not a question we like to ask, because we like to prefer to believe that we'll have few of them.
We've seen that a lot around, people we were working with that maybe just attended a 2-day workshop or thing where we're just kind of getting into the concepts and the tools. But then, a week later, 3 weeks later, whatever, what have you, they run into a scenario where they're confronted by the boss or a coworker, and things aren't quite unfolding the way they anticipated them, and they don't, it's kind of a bit deer in the headlights, don't know what to do. And then the easiest thing to do is just to go back to old habits, right? Because, oh, well, let's just default to the way things are doing, because that's the easy path. I can just slip into that with little effort.
And it may be because of ease, or just when we don't know what to do, right? This idea of preparing for not knowing what to do is not something we really talk about or think about. And yet we often don't know what to do. And it would be really helpful to leaders and their teams to be thinking about okay, here are the different things that we're going to do in order to keep on path, in that execution mode. We decided this is the plan, these are the goals, these are the objectives, this is what we want to happen. But if this goes sideways, how do we want to respond? What are the different sorts of workarounds that we, as an organization, as a group, and as an individual, that we engage when things go sideways? And somehow that feels like a lack of positive thinking, or it seems like doomsaying. People, that notion of preparing for what I view to be inevitable what now moments. This is inevitable. There will always be interruptions and disruptions. And if we're growing, changing, and transforming people, there also should always be times that we don't know what to do, because otherwise we're really not at the edges of our capabilities. And there's one response, which is, I don't know what to do, right? I don't know what to do. And that feels really threatening to me. So now I'll either avoid, return to an old habit, or be overly certain. I know exactly what to do, right? I fear I don't know what to do, so I know exactly what to do. All of those really are more of a threat response than a response to a changing terrain. And so when we have familiar territory, we have tons of tools that we can use. When the territory becomes unfamiliar, that requires a different approach that we don't really train for very often, because we want those uncertain transitional times to be very short.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we train to get through them fast, so that we can get back and think about the language you use, back on track, back on course. And yet, in my work, in my research, it is very clear that these are actually opportunity times when we shake free of the way that we have been doing things. Not only do new challenges come up, absolutely, but also new opportunities. So if we, rather than, I don't know what to do, can get to, I don't know what to do, and that is an opportunity to open some transitional learning space. So what do I know? What don't I know? Where are the gaps? And how might I explore that? And that doesn't have to be for weeks on end, but really making this, I don't know, a prompt to learn versus I don't know, a prompt to threat.
You know, it also makes me think about how so many cultures, company cultures, don't really encourage this idea or safety around saying I don't know.
Yeah.
Because and so if people are fearful of saying I don't know, that's going to be another blocker for people acknowledging that they need to take a step back and assess. And we were talking about that in the pre-show chat around the importance of taking that moment of assessment.
Well, and what's interesting is not only don't we create safety around people saying they don't know, we actually don't even really want leaders who don't know. Right? So it goes both ways. It's not, I think we often in those kind of cultural conversations are, think, oh, from the top down, we don't have that. But if your leader walks into the room and said, okay, I don't know what to do now, we really need to sit down and work together to determine that, there are consequences of our trust in that leader. So there are some really deep questions that we have to ask ourselves as we move from more predictable times, right? In the 19th and the 20th century, when we were having a certain leadership model that was cast a vision, develop a mission, goals and objectives in support of it, 5 and 10-year plans toward it, while there were always unpredictability, there was more predictability than there is now. And so those models actually made a lot of sense for the time. We've deconstructed a lot, change, dynamism in the marketplace. We all know the reasons for that. However, leading in dynamic circumstances is different. And that's why I like to draw upon emergency services professionals as a source of possible leadership models. Because these are people, whether we're talking about firefighters and other first responders, or we're talking about the emergency room doctors, they are both highly trained, highly equipped, and well rehearsed in the things that they do. They have protocols and so on and so forth to approach very dynamic circumstances, a fire, some kind of an emergency situation. But they also have this humility to recognize that those protocols are a guide, only a guide, in a circumstance that might change very, very rapidly. And so this idea of operating both with the confidence that comes from our expertise, our experience, and the protocols that we've developed, but also the humility to recognize they're being applied in a dynamic context, circumstances that are unpredictable, and now move from executing on them in the way that we would if things were if the skies were clear, and recognize that when we're applying things in stormy weather, it's a different circumstance, and we're drawing not only upon the protocols, but upon another set of sense making and discernment tools that in my research suggests we don't practice enough. The
Yeah.
sense making and discernment prior to decision is a real gap in our both personal and professional development for times when we get surprises.
And what have you found to be the best ways for folks to actually practice these things? Is it about being attuned in the moment when things are emerging and using real life and real world as opportunities, or are there ways to simulate and practice when the stakes are lower?
I would say a both and on this, and anyone who knows me, much of what I do is always a both and. But first of all, a rigorous self-awareness, which is something you can and I believe should be done prior, which is really exploring how do we respond to uncertainty. And I always say, I don't like trait resilience as a guide here, because this notion that some people are resilient and other people are not is really problematic, or even that resilience is just emotional bouncing back. It's more than that. It's really about identifying the resources that we need, and that's emotional resources, material, physical, and social resources, and doing so in a cultural way. And so this idea of looking beforehand and saying everyone is resilient and everyone is not resilient, it actually just depends upon the circumstances. We're all highly resilient. That's the reason that we are human beings who are able to survive in the world. And so this idea of identifying the places that we're more vulnerable to respond to our threat response. And for some people, it's money things. And for people, it's people things. And other people, it's environmental things. The more we can know about ourselves before we go into that kind of a circumstance, the more we can know, oh, wait a second, I'm being reactive here. Let me pause so that I can self-regulate around that. And then as teams, we can do the same. We can make time for our teams to do a rigorous self-awareness so that we can understand that the team works in this dynamic when we're in this circumstance, but in an emergency, we really want to take this person and bring them in, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of preparation. It's really like preparing for a storm. What's the plywood you need in the garage if you live in Tornado Alley? What are the root cellars that you want to build beforehand, so that when the tornado is coming, there's a recognition that there are certain things that we draw upon, and then we recognize we're in uncharted territory and we're humble in the dynamic situation.
Yeah, it's like also strikes me that there might be an opportunity to use this when we're thinking about recruiting, hiring,
Yep.
and
And retaining.
Yeah, and what kind of gaps we might have on the team, because what might seem like a functional gap that we might need to fill we might be more enlightened if we look and think about, hey, what are the deficiencies we have from a ability to cope with certain emergent kind of situations.
Yeah. And those emergent situations don't have to be the big disruption. That's why I always say disruptions and interruptions, because some people are great with the big disruption, right? When the big problem comes, they're great at kind of dealing with that big emergency. But if someone walks in and is late with a PowerPoint and now disrupts a schedule, they can fly off the handle. And other people, it's the opposite. So that's where that rigorous self-awareness comes in. It's how do I have tools that I use with people. There's a resilience wheel that I use that's really helpful here, because I have people self-assess on if the big bad happened. If you have the big disruption, and do a self-assessment around different kind of scenarios, and how have you tended in the past to deal with disruptions in these areas. But then I ask them to do it again if it was a small interruption, right? The difference between losing all of your money, losing your savings in your 401k, or forgetting your wallet on the way to work. They're both financial interruptions and disruptions. But you'd be surprised how many people are like, well, if the big bad happened with money, I know exactly what I would do. I'm fine. But when I forget my wallet on the way to work, it throws me for a loop and can ruin my day. So
Yeah.
it's not only the different scenarios where we can have it, it's even the scale of the interruption that can be very different for people. And I don't think that we're not self-aware. It's not even I don't think. The research is quite clear that we're not self-aware on these and other variables. And that rigorous self-awareness as a starting place, it's not the end all be all, but it's a beginning to understand, how do I deal with uncharted territory? Because the more I know about how I deal with uncharted territory, the faster I can see where the gaps are and begin to see where I can develop myself, or as a leader, how I can develop my team, or I can work together for the team and I to develop each other
Yeah.
around these areas of dealing with interruption and disruption.
Strikes me as a fun assessment that could be done as part of a team.
Yeah, I do it with teams. I do it with individuals, with teams, and the comparison and contrast is really interesting, because people who are having an epiphany, oh, I didn't even see it this way, their team will look at them and say, oh, we did.
Yeah.
Right? We knew that about you. You didn't know that about you, but we knew.
Yeah.
But it's more fun and less high stakes, let's say, than a 360 or something where you feel like you're being assessed. It's really a depth of understanding about ourselves, so that we can be less reactive, more regulated, and then more exploratory. Because if we can pause to self-regulate in these moments, it's more likely we can draw upon the curiosity and the inquiry that we need to understand new terrain, rather than the reactivity that comes when we're in the threat response and we're either, it's that true fight, flight, freeze that we tend to do in those moments, which tend to be binary and not creative. So the very moment that we need that creativity most is the very time that our brains are combating it.
Wow, super cool. Well, I know that we could kind of talk for such a long time, and we'll have to get you on the podcast sometime soon. And
Love to do
super
that.
excited about the book coming out. Hope it does really well, and we'll just keep the conversation going. Such a pleasure having you on today, John.
Love it. Thanks a million. Thanks for having me on. I enjoy it, and I'd love to be on the podcast in the future. So see you all soon.